We're building a model of the macroeconomy, and this model that we're building is based on the idea of John Maynard Keynes, that the economy is, at its heart, driven by demand. The model that we're building is called the aggregate expenditure model. Aggregate expenditure meaning demand, what people are planning to spend. And I want to begin with the circular flow diagram and connect this familiar picture with the graphs that we've been drawing to represent aggregate expenditure in the macroeconomy. We're working towards a notion of equilibrium that's going to help you understand how the macroeconomy works and to predict how the macroeconomy will change when the economic environment changes around it. So let's go back to the circular flow diagram and look at its heart. The heart of the circular flow of resources in the economy is the relationship between consumers, that is households, and businesses or firms. Resources flow in this direction. Consumers put labor, capital, raw materials into the factor markets, where they are hired by firms who use them to produce goods and services. These goods and services are then purchased by households. This purchase is called consumer spending. So as resources are flowing clockwise around this diagram, money is flowing counterclockwise. That is, the money that consumers pay in goods and services markets for goods and services is called consumer spending. And here's the real consumer spending, the real goods and services going into the household. This money then winds up in firms, and firms use this money to pay for the land, labor, and capital, that is the factors of production that they've used to make the goods and services. And that money winds back up in the hands of households as income. So what we have here is consumer spending on goods and services that winds up in the firms who use this money to pay for the resources that created the goods and services. A nice, tight, balanced circular flow. If consumer spending is the only element of demand, then it must be true that in equilibrium, what consumers are spending, that is what they are paying for goods and services, winds up exactly right back in their hands as income, that is, as wages, interest payments, rent, and profits from business. So there's a balance here. Spending equals income. Now you can imagine that we could introduce another factor into this story that would disrupt this balance. Let's suppose that there's money that flows out of this circle, that is a leakage out of the circular flow in the form of taxes. That is, consumers have their income reduced because they have to pay money to the government in the form of taxes. So let's put another green arrow here that indicates money flowing into the government. Well, how is this going to affect the overall flow of resources? If consumers have to divert some of their income into the government in the form of tax payments, that reduces the amount that they can spend on goods and services. Firms, in turn, will respond to this reduced demand by producing less output, which means they're going to be hiring fewer resources in the factor markets, which in turn is going to reduce consumer income. So this leakage out of the system causes everything to be upset. The balance is upset, and everything has to adjust until a new equilibrium is established. We're going to see that process more clearly, I believe, over in the aggregate expenditure diagram. So let's take the idea from the circular flow and now translate it into a picture over here in this aggregate expenditure diagram. Here we have it, the aggregate expenditure curve that we've been drawing before. The black dotted line represents points where income is equal to aggregate expenditure or total spending. These are the points of equilibrium or balance in the macroeconomy, where people are buying everything that the factories are producing, and they're paying for it with the income that they get when the factories pay them their paychecks. The red line represents the consumption function that we've developed before. Its intercept representing autonomous consumption, and the slope representing the marginal propensity to consume, that fraction of each additional dollar of income that consumers spend on goods and services rather than saving. Think now about the consumption function. We've talked about it before. The consumption function is what we've drawn in this picture. And in order to draw this line in this graph, we have to hold things constant. Consumption spending plans depend on autonomous consumption, that is what you have to buy regardless of what your income and other factors are, your bare necessities. It also is going to depend on your wealth. How much do you have in your mutual funds and your savings accounts? It will also depend on your income, and that's what the diagram is all about. As income increases, you will do more consuming, especially if you are credit constrained. That is, if you have to have a paycheck in order to do any shopping. However, if you can get credit, you're more likely to do shopping. That is, the easier it is to borrow money, the more likely it is that you will be spending on goods and services. Another factor is taxes. That is, the more the government takes out of your paycheck in the form of taxes, the less you have to spend. The smaller is your disposable income. There's also the matter of prices. As prices increase, even though we've adjusted for the effect on your income, that is, we're measuring real consumption as a function of real income, when prices increase, your savings account then seems to be smaller. That is, your $100,000 saving has a smaller purchasing power when the price level rises, and that can cause you to do less consumption. There are other factors that influence your behavior, like expectations. What do you think the future holds? Are you expecting a raise next year? You might spend some of it now. But we hold all of those other factors constant. Whenever we draw this picture, we assume that the only thing changing is your consumer income. If we allow something else to change, we have to draw this consumption function all over again. That is, suppose we imagine that consumer wealth increases, perhaps due to a boom in the stock market. If the stock market booms and people feel wealthier, then the consumption function shifts upwards. This indicates that at any given level of income that you choose, consumers, rather than planning to spend this much on goods and services, are now spending a larger amount. Spending plans have increased due to a sense of increased wealth. If consumers are planning to spend more money at any given income level, then you have to shift the consumption function upwards. On the other hand, if taxes were to increase, that is, if the government takes a bigger chunk of consumer income, then the consumption function shifts downwards, showing at any given income level now, consumers are planning to spend less than they were planning to spend before, because their disposable income has shrunk. We could show the effect of taxes in our mathematical expression for the consumption function. We could do it this way. Consumption is equal to autonomous consumption plus the marginal propensity to consume times this quantity, income minus taxes. You might call this thing in parentheses your disposable income, and when taxes increase, consumption is going to be reduced. Notice, however, that consumption is not going to be reduced by the full amount of any tax burden. Why is that? Because the increase in taxes effectively reduces your income. But not all of that is going to feed directly into a reduction in consumption. Some of that additional tax payment is going to come out of your savings account, right? Because anytime you get extra money, you save some of it and you spend the rest. Well, when your income is pulled down by taxes, some of that comes from a reduction in your consumption, but the rest of it comes from a reduction in your savings. That's why an increase in taxes does not have a one-for-one effect on reducing your consumption. Part of the increase in taxes is paid for by a reduction in your savings. Well, let's go back now to the circular flow diagram, because consumption is only one part of the circular flow. It's probably the most important part, and as I've said before, it's the heart of this circular flow story. But there are other leakages and injections that modify the diagram. We've already talked about the leakage of taxes. Taxes flow out of the system, reducing consumption. But there are other spending that goes into the system that increases the overall level of economic activity. One of these is government spending. The government spends on goods and services, and goods and services flow out of the goods market into the government, where the government uses them to provide for public assistance, to provide for public goods and other things. So government money goes into the goods and services market, and goods and services flow into the government. This little exchange is called government spending. Another injection of demand into the system is businesses spending. That is, goods and services flow into businesses in the form of investment spending, plant, equipment, capital goods that businesses acquire, and businesses pay for them by spending money in the goods and services market. So here we have investment spending. This is the spending on drill presses, plant, factories, and, importantly, inventories. When businesses acquire inventories and build them up in their warehouses, this is a form of investment spending. Another injection into the system is the spending of foreigners. So whenever foreigners import our products into their countries, then we experience that as net exports. That is, the flow of goods and services abroad, which is foreigners buying our goods less the goods we buy from them, we call this exchange net exports. So net exports, government spending, and investment spending are all injections of demand into the system, just like taxes were a leakage out of the circular flow. So we can go through and label all of these with their names. This exchange right here is called consumption. This exchange right here, this one-way leakage, is called taxes. Right here, we have the government buying goods and services. We call that government spending. This exchange is called business spending or investment. And up here, we have net exports. We use these symbols over and over in our analysis of aggregate expenditure. And the flow down here from firms out of what's left over into the households is income. In the end, income is going to be everything that households are spending, less the leakages, like taxes, plus the injections, government spending, business spending, and the spending of foreigners. Now, let's go over and represent this into our aggregate expenditure diagram. You see, because what we're doing now is we're adding other spending. The red line that we've drawn before represented the behavior of consumers. This was consumption as a function of income. Now, however, we want to add in the spending of everybody else. So I put in another red line, and notice I've made this horizontal because these choices are autonomous. That is, the government, businesses, all of that spending for the moment we are imagining does not depend on income. It's independent of income, so it enters our model as a constant, also called exogenous, determined outside the model. Well, if you add government, business, and foreign spending onto the spending of consumers, then you have to do this horizontal addition. If this is 10 right here, you've got to add it on to this line at every point, shift it up by the amount of 10. This is called a vertical summation. Just add it on vertically, and the line shifts up. So now what we have is aggregate expenditure is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. That's what aggregate expenditure is all about. And here's how you show it in the picture. Take the consumption function, consumer spending as a function of income, and add on all of these other spending plans, the spending plan of business, government, and foreigners. And that now gives you a line that we can call the aggregate expenditure line. The aggregate expenditure is a function, so I'm using parentheses here to denote that, is a function of income because consumer spending increases as income increases according to the marginal propensity to consume. But for the moment, all of those other factors, all of those other leakages and injections, we are taking as constant. They don't depend directly on income, and therefore they can be represented by this horizontal line and added onto vertically the consumption function to give us the new aggregate expenditure line. So now we're headed towards an equilibrium. The equilibrium is going to have the same idea as that circular flow, that when you consider leakages and injections, everything has to balance. And we got this cast of characters, consumers, businesses, the government, and foreigners, whose spending plans have to, in equilibrium, balance the output of factories.